There are those whose names echo through centuries, carved into monuments and printed in textbooks. Generals who conquered nations, emperors who built cities that lasted 1,000 years, revolutionaries who tore down old orders and raised new ones from the ashes. These are the figures we remember, the ones whose portraits hang in museums and whose deeds fill the pages of history books. We learn their names as children and carry them with us into adulthood, these titans who shaped the world. But there are others, equally consequential, whose influence was so profound and yet so quiet that history itself seemed unable to decide what to do with their memory. They slipped through the cracks of the historical record, mentioned in passing. Footnoted rather than featured, their significance recognized only by those who know where to look. Sometimes the most important figures in history are not the loudest ones, not the ones who commanded armies or signed treaties, but the ones who stood in the background, whose presence changed everything without anyone quite realizing it at the time. And sometimes when we trace the threads of great events backward through the decades, we find at the source not a treaty, not a battle, not a proclamation by some powerful king, but something far more unexpected. Sometimes we find a girl, a young woman, barely old enough to understand the forces that swirled around her, making decisions she never asked to make, set upon a path she never chose. And from that single life, that single choice, consequences ripple outward through time, growing larger and larger until they reshape the world itself. This is one of history's strangest truths, that the mightiest empires can be brought low, not by invading armies or economic collapse alone, but by the quiet accumulation of small decisions, personal choices, human frailties that compound over years and decades until they become catastrophic. The powerful believe they control events, but often events control them. And the hinges upon which history turns are sometimes found in the most unexpected places. This is the story of such a girl. She was not a queen when our story begins, though she would become one. She was not a warrior, though wars would be fought in her name. She was not an assassin, though. Empires would fall because of her. She was simply a princess, one of dozens. Born into the great royal houses of her era, raised to be useful, raised to be traded, raised to serve purposes far beyond her own happiness or desires. Her childhood was spent in palaces, surrounded by luxury, but also surrounded by expectations that would shape every moment of her life. She learned languages and music and etiquette, all the things that a princess was supposed to know. She learned to smile when she did not feel like smiling, to be gracious to people she did not like, to subordinate her own wishes to the needs of her family and her future husband's family. She was being prepared for a role, though she did not yet know what that role would be, or how much would depend upon how she played. Looking back across the span of history, it is difficult to find another single individual whose life had such far-reaching consequences because of her. 3 of the mightiest empires the world had ever known would crumble into dust because of her. Maps would be redrawn, millions would die, and the entire trajectory of human civilization would shift in ways that continue to shape our world today. The Russian Empire, which had endured for centuries and stretched across 1/6 of the Earth's surface. From the frozen shores of the Arctic to the warm waters of the Black Sea, from the borders of Poland to the Pacific coast of Asia. The German Empire, whose armies were considered the finest in the world, whose industries were the most advanced, whose scientists and philosophers were the envy of civilization. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, that ancient patchwork of peoples held together by tradition and the Habsburg crown, an empire that had existed in one form or another for more than 600 years. All 3 would fall, all 3 would shatter into pieces, and when historians searched for the origins of their collapse, they would find again and again threads leading back to this one young woman and the marriage she was made to enter. How is such a thing possible? How can a teenage girl with no army at her command, no treasury at her disposal, no political power of her own, bring down empires? The answer lies not in what she did, but in what she represented, and in the world she was born into. It was a world where the fates of nations hung upon marriages, where princesses were pieces on a chessboard played by kings, where a single union between two royal houses could trigger decades of war or secure generations of peace. To understand her story, we must first understand that world, a world so different from our own that it can be difficult to imagine, and yet a world whose collapse created the conditions in which we still live today. The year is 1853, and to those alive at this moment, the great powers of the world seem unshakable. Across the continents, empires hold sway over hundreds of millions of people, their authority unquestioned, their futures seemingly assured. In the palaces of Europe, kings and emperors rule as their ancestors have ruled for centuries. Their power derived from tradition, from divine right, from the simple fact that things have always been this way, and surely always will be. The idea that these great dynasties might one day vanish, that the empires they governed might dissolve into chaos and revolution, would seem absurd to those who lived in their shadow. Empires did not simply disappear. They had existed for as long as anyone could remember, and they would exist for as long as anyone could imagine. This was the bedrock assumption of the age, the foundation upon which all of political life was built. And like all foundations, it would prove to be less solid than it appeared. Beneath the surface of this seemingly stable world, forces were at work that would, within the span of a single lifetime, bring all of it crashing down. The world of the mid-19th century was a world of rapid change, even as its rulers clung to the old ways. Steam engines were transforming transportation and warfare, making it possible to move armies and goods across continents at speeds that would have been unimaginable a generation before. Factories were rising in the cities, drawing millions of peasants from the countryside to become workers in a new industrial age. Workers who would soon begin to demand rights and representation that the old order was not prepared to grant. Ideas about democracy, about nationalism, about the rights of ordinary people to govern themselves, were spreading through the population like fire through dry grass. In the old dynasties, those ancient families who had ruled Europe for generations were struggling to adapt to a world that was changing faster than they could comprehend. At the center of this world stood the great royal courts, where the business of nations was conducted through a peculiar blend of diplomacy and family arrangement. To understand how power worked in this era, one must understand that the kings and emperors of Europe were not strangers to one another, but relatives, cousins, uncles, nephews, in-laws, connected by a web of marriages that had been woven over centuries. The Queen of England might be the grandmother of the German Kaiser and the cousin of the Russian Tsar. The Emperor of Austria might be the uncle of the King of Spain. A princess born in a small German duchy might find herself, through marriage, sitting upon the throne of the largest nation on earth. These family connections were not mere curiosities, not simply interesting facts to be noted in passing. They were the very foundation of international relations, the glue that held the system together, and the fault lines along which it would eventually crack. Treaties between nations were sealed with marriages. Alliances were forged not through diplomacy alone, but through the joining of royal bloodlines. When a king wished to secure peace with a rival, he might offer his daughter as a bride for the rival's son. When an emperor wished to strengthen an alliance, he might seek a princess from the allied house to marry into his own family. This was the way things were done, the way things had always been done, the way things would always be done, or so everyone believed. The system had its own logic, its own rules, its own expectations. And at the heart of this system were the princesses themselves, the young women whose bodies and bloodlines were the currency of international politics. They were raised from birth to understand their role, to accept their fate, to go where they were sent and marry whom they were told to marry. Their happiness was secondary to the needs of the state. Their personal desires were irrelevant. They were instruments of policy, not people with the right to determine their own destinies. This was the system that had governed Europe for generations. And it was a system that placed extraordinary weight upon the lives of young women. From the moment of their birth, they were assets to be deployed, pieces to be moved on a board whose dimensions they could barely comprehend. A princess might grow up speaking one language, practicing one religion, absorbing one culture, only to be Sent at the age of 16 or 17 to a foreign land where she would have to learn everything anew, she might never see her parents again. She might never speak her native language except in private moments of homesickness. She might bear children who would be raised according to customs entirely foreign to her, who would grow up speaking languages she had learned as an adult, who would belong to a world she had never chosen. And through it all, she would be expected to smile, to be gracious, to represent her birth family with dignity, while serving her new family with loyalty. It was an impossible burden, and not all princesses bore it equally well. It was into this world that our subject was born, a girl whose name would one day be spoken in the same breath as the fall of empires. But in the year of her birth, she was simply another princess, another piece on the great chessboard of European politics, another life to be shaped and molded, and eventually deployed in the service of dynastic interests. Her parents were royalty, connected by blood to the greatest houses in Europe, though they themselves did not rule over any significant territory. Through her mother, she was the granddaughter of Queen Victoria of England, that formidable monarch who sat upon the throne of the world's greatest empire and who scattered her descendants across the royal houses of Europe like seeds blown by the wind. Through her father, she carried the blood of ancient German princes, men who had ruled their small domains for centuries and who had intermarried with every significant family on the continent. And through the intricate mathematics of royal genealogy, she had claims, however distant, to thrones across Europe, claims that made her valuable, claims that would eventually determine her fate. The three great powers that would one day fall, because of her, were in the middle of the 19th century, at the height of their strength. Each was a colossus in its own right, controlling vast territories and commanding armies that numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Each was ruled by an ancient dynasty that had held power for generations, dynasties whose members believed with absolute certainty that they had been chosen by God to rule. And each, though it appeared eternal to those who lived within its borders, was already showing the first subtle signs of the decay that would eventually bring it down. The cracks were small, almost invisible, easily overlooked by those who did not wish to see them. But they were there, spreading slowly through the foundations, waiting for the moment when the weight of events would cause the whole structure to come crashing down. The Russian Empire was the largest nation on Earth, a realm so vast that it spanned 11 time zones, stretching from the borders of Poland in the west to the shores of the Pacific Ocean in the east. Within this immense territory lived over 100 million people, speaking dozens of languages, practicing different religions, belonging to ethnic groups that had little in common with one another. Except their subjection to the Tsar, they were Russians and Ukrainians, Poles and Finns, Georgians and Armenians, Jews and Muslims, Ipols of the frozen north and peoples of the sun-baked south, all gathered together under the rule of a single man who sat upon a throne in St. Petersburg and claimed to be the father of all his peoples. The Tsar himself was an autocrat in the truest sense of the word, a ruler whose power was theoretically unlimited, whose word was law, whose will was the will of the state. Unlike the constitutional monarchs of Western Europe, who shared power with parliaments and prime ministers, the Russian Tsar ruled alone, answerable to no one but God. This system had endured for centuries, but by the middle of the 19th century, it was showing dangerous cracks. Russia had been defeated in the Crimean War, a conflict that exposed the backwardness of its military, the corruption of its bureaucracy, and the fundamental weakness of a society built upon the labor of serfs. The peasants who worked the land were still, in the 1850s, the property of the nobles who owned the estates, bought and sold like cattle, forbidden to leave without permission, subject to punishments that would have been considered barbaric in Western Europe. Intellectuals in the cities were whispering about reform, about change, about the need to modernize before it was too late. Some whispered about more radical things, about revolution, about tearing down the whole rotten structure and building something new. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia since 1613, would endure for several more decades. But the seeds of its destruction were already planted, waiting for the right conditions to germinate. The German lands, meanwhile, were not yet a single empire but a patchwork of kingdoms. Principalities and duchies, dozens of separate states united only by language and culture and a shared memory of having once been part of the Holy Roman Empire. The largest and most powerful of these states was Prussia, a kingdom built upon military discipline and efficient bureaucracy, a nation where the army was not merely an instrument of the state, but its very soul. For generations, Prussian soldiers had been drilled in the arts of war, and Prussian generals had developed tactics that would make their armies the most feared in Europe. The Prussian officer corps was the most prestigious institution in the land, and Prussian society was organized, to a degree unmatched elsewhere, around the needs of the military. This was a nation that existed for war, that understood itself through war. It found its purpose and its meaning in the clash of armies on the battlefield. In the 1860s, the Prussian minister Otto von Bismarck began the process of unifying the German lands under Prussian leadership. Through a series of carefully calculated wars, first against Denmark, then against Austria, then against France, he forged a new empire that would stretch from the Baltic Sea to the Alps, from the Rhine to the borders of Russia. When this process was complete in 1871, the German Empire emerged as the most powerful military force on the European continent, led by the Hohenzollern dynasty and driven by a hunger for what its leaders called its place in the sun. But this new empire was also a nation built on contradictions that would eventually tear it apart. Its industrial economy was rapidly modernizing, but its political system remained autocratic. Its people were proud of their new nation, but that pride could easily shade into arrogance and belligerence. And its very success in the wars of unification had created enemies who would never forgive or forget. Enemies who would wait patiently for the day when they could have their revenge. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was perhaps the strangest of the sins. Three great powers, a realm that had no single national identity, no common language, or no unifying culture except for the Habsburg dynasty itself. Within its borders lived Germans and Hungarians, Czechs and Poles, Italians and Croats, Romanians and Ruthenians, and many others besides. Its group had its own language, its own traditions, its own grievances, and its own aspirations for independence or greater autonomy. The empire was held together not by shared identity but by shared loyalty to the emperor, and by a complex system of compromises and concessions that balanced the interests of its many peoples against one another. This was a fragile arrangement, at best, and everyone who thought seriously about it knew that it could not last forever. The Emperor Franz Joseph, who ascended to the throne in 1848 and would reign for nearly 7 decades, spent his entire life trying to hold this patchwork realm together. But he was fighting against the tide of history. Nationalism, the idea that each people should have its own nation, was sweeping across Europe in the 19th century, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire was particularly vulnerable to its appeal. Every ethnic group within the empire dreamed of independence, and every neighboring nation dreamed of annexing the territories where their fellow nationals lived. The Serbs dreamed of a greater Serbia that would include the South Slavic peoples. Of the Habsburg realm, Italians dreamed of completing their unification by absorbing the Italian-speaking regions of Austria. The Romanians dreamed of uniting with their brethren in Transylvania. And the empire's own subject peoples dreamed of the day when they would no longer be subjects at all. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was a tinderbox, and everyone knew that someday, somehow, a spark would set it ablaze. What no one knew was when that spark would come, or where, or from whom. These were the three empires whose fates would become intertwined with the life of one young woman.
Yeah.
At the time of her birth, they appeared to be permanent fixtures of the international landscape, as solid and enduring as the mountains themselves. Their armies were vast, their treasuries were full, their rulers sat upon thrones that had been occupied for generations. The Romanovs in St. Petersburg, the Hohenzollerns in Berlin, the Habsburgs in Vienna, these were the great dynasties, the pillars upon which European civilization rested. But history is not kind to those who mistake the present for the future, and none of these empires would survive into the second decade of the 20th century. They would fall, all three of them, in a cascade of revolution and war that would reshape the entire world. And when historians looked back to understand why this happened, they would find, at the center of the story, a young woman whose marriage had connected all three of these doomed realms, and whose presence at the heart of power had accelerated their destruction. The princess who would one day be blamed for the fall of empires was born in a small palace in the German lands, in the Grand Duchy of Hesse, far from the great capitals where the fate of nations was decided. Her father was the Grand Duke, ruler of a territory so modest that it barely registered on the maps of Europe, a quiet backwater in the German patchwork whose main significance lay in its family connections rather than its political power. Her mother was a princess of England, the daughter of Queen Victoria herself, which meant that from her earliest days, the child was connected by blood to the mightiest throne in the world. The British Empire at this time stretched across every continent, encompassing a quarter of the world's population. And Queen Victoria was its matriarch, a grandmother to half the royalty of Europe, a figure of immense symbolic importance whose family connections gave her influence far beyond her constitutional powers. To be a grandchild of Queen Victoria was to be part of an extended family that included the heirs to nearly every throne in Europe. A family whose gatherings resembled summits of world leaders more than ordinary family reunions. She was one of many children, neither the eldest nor the most prominent. And in her early years, there was little to suggest that she would one day stand at the center of world-shaking events. Her childhood was marked by tragedy almost from the beginning. When she was only 6 years old, diphtheria swept through the family, claiming the lives of her youngest sister and, most devastatingly, her mother. The loss of her mother at such a young age left a wound that would never fully heal, shaping her personality in ways that would have profound consequences later in her life. She became withdrawn, serious, prone to melancholy, and to a kind of religious intensity that set her apart from her more carefree relatives. Those who knew her as a child described her as shy and reserved, uncomfortable in large social gatherings, happiest when she was with a small circle of trusted intimates. These were not ideal qualities for someone destined to become an empress, to preside over a glittering court, to win the loyalty of nobles and the love of a people. But no one knew then what she would become. And so no one thought to worry about whether her temperament was suited to the role that fate would assign. After her mother's death, she spent much of her childhood in England. At the court of her grandmother, Queen Victoria, the old queen doted on her grandchildren, and this particular granddaughter became a special favorite. Perhaps because her serious disposition and religious nature reminded Victoria of herself. The young princess learned to speak English as fluently as German, absorbing the culture and manners of the British court even as she remained technically a German princess. She was educated in the manner appropriate to her station, learning languages and music and drawing, learning the arts of household management and social grace that would be expected of any royal wife. She was also, unusually for a princess of her era, encouraged to develop her own mind, to read widely, to think seriously about questions of faith and morality. Queen Victoria believed that her granddaughters should be more than merely decorative, and she encouraged them to cultivate their intellects as well as their accomplishments. This education would serve the princess well in some ways, but it would also contribute to her difficulties later. For she developed strong opinions and a stubborn conviction in the rightness of her own judgment that would make it difficult for her to accept advice or to compromise with those who disagreed with her. The first hint of what her future might hold came when she was still quite young, not yet in her teens. Visitors began arriving at her family's palace, diplomats and courtiers from distant lands, who looked at her with appraising eyes and spoke to her parents in low, serious voices. She was being evaluated, assessed, measured against the requirements of princes and kingdoms she had never seen. It was a strange and unsettling experience for a child, to be examined as though she were a piece of merchandise, but she learned to endure it with the grace that was expected of her. Princesses were taught from an early age that this was their lot in life, that their value lay not in who they were, but in whom they might marry. And she accepted this truth, as she accepted so many other things, with resignation, if not with happiness. The negotiations about her future continued for years. Various matches proposed and considered and rejected. Her fate hanging in the balance as the great powers calculated their interests and weighed their options. And then, when she was 12 years old, she met him for the first time. He was the heir to the Russian throne, a young man whose father ruled an empire of more than 100 million souls, who would one day command the largest army in the world and sit upon the most powerful throne in Europe. His name was Nicholas, and he had come to England for a family wedding. It was one of those grand gatherings that brought together the scattered descendants of Queen Victoria from across the continent. She was only a child, really barely more than a girl, and he was not much older, a teenager just beginning to understand his own future. But something passed between them at that first meeting, some spark of connection that neither of them would ever forget. He thought her beautiful, with her reddish gold hair and her serious gray eyes. She thought him kind and gentle, different from the stiff and formal princes she had met before. They spent time together during the festivities, talking and walking in the gardens. And by the time the gathering ended and they returned to their separate countries, something had begun that would not easily be ended. Years passed, and the girl became a young woman. She was 16 now, then 17, then 18, approaching the age when a final decision about her marriage could no longer be delayed. The heir to the Russian throne had not forgotten her. Letters passed between them, carried by trusted messengers across the length of Europe. Letters in which two young people poured out their hearts to one another in the formal but passionate language of the age. But there were obstacles, serious obstacles, to a match between them. She was Protestant, raised in the Lutheran faith of her German homeland, and he was Orthodox, belonging to the ancient Church of Russia that traced its lineage back to Byzantium. For her to marry him, she would have to convert, to abandon the faith in which she had been raised, and embrace a religion whose practices and beliefs were in many ways foreign to her. This was not a small thing, especially for someone of her intense religious nature. And she hesitated, torn between her love for the young man and her loyalty to the faith of her childhood. His mother, the Empress of Russia, had grave doubts about the match as well. She worried that this German princess was too young, too inexperienced, too unfamiliar with the ways of the Russian court to make a suitable empress. She worried about the girl's health, which was delicate, and about her reserved personality, which seemed ill-suited to the public role of an empress. She worried, perhaps most of all, about the political implications of the match. Russia and Germany were not enemies, but neither were they the closest of allies. And there were those at the Russian court who would have preferred a bride from a more strategically useful house. For years, the question of whom the heir would marry remained unresolved, a source of anxiety for everyone involved. Other candidates were proposed, other matches suggested, but the young heir to the throne refused them all. He had given his heart to the German princess, and he would not take it back. The decision, when it finally arrived, came not from the diplomats or the courts, but from death itself. The old emperor of Russia, Alexander III, that imposing figure who had seemed as permanent as the Russian winter, fell ill in the autumn of 1894. He was only 49 years old, still in what should have been the prime of his life. But his health had been declining for years, weakened by the strain of ruling such a vast and troubled empire. The illness progressed rapidly, and within weeks it became clear that he would not recover. His heir, the gentle young man who had loved the German princess for nearly a decade, was about to become the most powerful man in the world, but he was not ready. He had been raised to be an heir, not a ruler, kept at the margins of power by a father who believed he would have many more years to prepare his son for the throne. Now, suddenly there was no more time, and Nicholas found himself thrust into a role he did not feel equipped to fill. In this moment of crisis, Nicholas made a decision that would shape the rest of his life and the fate of his empire. He refused to ascend to the throne without her by his side. Against the wishes of his mother, against the advice of his ministers, against all the careful calculations of international diplomacy, he insisted that the German princess, and only she, would be his wife. It was, in its way, a romantic gesture, the stuff of fairy tales and love stories, prince who loved a princess so deeply that he would defy convention and tradition to marry her. But romance and politics make uneasy bedfellows, and this romantic gesture would have consequences that neither the prince nor the princess could have imagined. The objections that had seemed so important when the old emperor was alive suddenly melted away in the urgency of the moment. There was no time for prolonged negotiations, no time for alternative candidates, no time for anything except to bring the princess to Russia as quickly as possible and make her the new emperor's wife. Within weeks of the old emperor's death, she arrived in the Russian capital. The journey from her German homeland to St. Petersburg was long and exhausting. Through the gray autumn landscape of Central Europe and into the vast flat expanses of the Russian plain, she traveled by train. Watching through the window as the world she knew gave way to a world that was strange and new, and more than a little frightening. The language she heard spoken around her was not the German or English of her childhood, but Russian, a tongue she barely understood. The faces of the people she passed were not the familiar faces of home, but the faces of strangers who looked at her with curiosity and sometimes with suspicion. She was leaving behind everything she had ever known, her family, her country, her faith, her very identity, and traveling toward a future that was as uncertain as it was grand. She was 22 years old. She was about to become the Empress of all the Russias. Within days of her arrival, she converted to the Orthodox faith, taking a new name, as was the custom. The princess who had been born Alix of Hesse became Alexandra Fyodorovna, a name that sounded foreign even to her own ears. The conversion was not merely a formality. It required her to renounce the Protestant faith in which she had been raised and to embrace fully and completely the ancient traditions of the Russian Orthodox Church. For someone of her intense religious nature, this was a profound and difficult step. She took it seriously, studying the doctrines and practices of her new faith with the same intensity she brought to everything she did. In time, she would become more devoutly Orthodox than many who had been born into the faith, finding in its rituals and mysteries a spiritual home that satisfied her deep need for certainty and meaning. But the conversion also set her apart from the Russian aristocracy, many of whom regarded her newfound piety with skepticism, seeing it as the excessive zeal of a convert rather than the natural devotion of one born into the faith. And within hours of the old emperor's funeral, she was married to the new one. The timing was startling, even shocking to some observers. The old emperor's body was barely cold. The period of official mourning had only just begun. And yet here was the new emperor, standing before the altar with his German bride, exchanging vows that would bind them together for life. It was November of 1894. The Russian winter was closing in, and the capital was draped in the black of mourning, even as it prepared for the celebration of a royal wedding. The contrast was jarring, the solemnity of death mingling with the joy of matrimony in a way that seemed almost improper. Critics whispered that the new empress had arrived in Russia behind a coffin, that her reign had begun under the shadow of death, that this was an ill omen for the future. These whispers would grow louder in the years to come, as one misfortune after another seemed to confirm the suspicion that this foreign princess had brought bad luck to the land of her adoption. The wedding took place in the Winter Palace, a vast and glittering edifice that served as the ceremonial heart of the Russian Empire. The palace was a monument to imperial grandeur, its endless corridors and magnificent halls designed to overawe visitors with the wealth and power of the Romanov dynasty. Here the Tsars had held court for generations, surrounded by nobles and ministers, ambassadors, and generals. The entire apparatus of government gathered around the sacred person of the autocrat. The wedding ceremony itself was ancient and elaborate, filled with rituals that stretched back centuries, designed to impress upon all who witnessed it the grandeur and permanence of the Romanov dynasty. The new empress wore a gown of silver and white, heavy with jewels, and a crown that had been worn by empresses for generations. Her husband stood beside her in his military uniform, decorated with the medals and ribbons that signified his rank. And all around them, the great nobles of Russia watched and whispered, assessing this foreign princess who had come to rule over them. Many of the observers were skeptical, and their skepticism would prove difficult to overcome. The new empress was too young, they said, too inexperienced, too unfamiliar with the ways of the Russian court to make a suitable consort for the Tsar. She spoke Russian poorly, the heavy German accent that grated on aristocratic ears, and she seemed uncomfortable. With the endless ceremonies and social obligations that were expected of an empress, the Russian court was a complicated and treacherous place. A world of intrigue and rivalry where alliances shifted constantly and where a single misstep could ruin a reputation forever. To navigate this world successfully required skills that the new empress did not possess: the ability to charm and flatter, to build alliances and neutralize enemies, to project warmth and accessibility even when one felt neither. She was too reserved, too private, too unwilling to play the games that court politics required, and worst of all, in the eyes of many, she was German. Born in a land that many Russians regarded with suspicion and hostility, the old rivalries between the German and Slavic peoples ran deep, stretching back centuries to a time when German knights had crusaded against the pagan tribes of the Baltic, and when German merchants had dominated the trade of Eastern Europe. Russia had fought wars against German powers, and there were those at court who could not forget that the new empress came from the land of the enemy. It did not matter that she had renounced her German identity, that she had embraced the Orthodox faith, that she proclaimed her love for Russia at every opportunity. To her critics, she would always be the German, the foreigner, the outsider, who had somehow insinuated herself into the heart of Russian power. These critics would never accept her, no matter what she did, and their hostility would poison her reign from the very beginning. She sensed this hostility, felt it in the cold glances and the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room. And it made her retreat even further into herself, trusting fewer and fewer people, relying more and more on her husband. In her own judgment, the early years of her marriage were, by most accounts, happy ones, at least in private. She and her husband were deeply in love, devoted to one another in a way that was unusual among royal couples of their era. Theirs was not an arranged match in the usual sense, not a union of convenience or political calculation, but a genuine love match. A marriage between two people who had chosen each other freely, and who remained committed to each other through all the trials that lay ahead. The letters they exchanged, which would later be published and read by millions, revealed a tenderness and intimacy that was remarkable for any couple, let alone an emperor and empress. They called each other by affectionate nicknames, shared their fears and hopes, supported each other through difficulties, maintained their devotion even when the pressures of their position might have driven them apart. In a world where royal marriages were often cold and formal, where kings kept mistresses and queens maintained their dignity through emotional distance, their marriage was something rare and precious. But this private happiness existed alongside growing public difficulties. The new empress struggled to adapt to the demands of her position, to the endless ceremonies and receptions and audiences that filled her days. She was expected to be the first lady of Russian society, to preside over the glittering social life of the court, to charm and entertain the nobles and diplomats and visiting dignitaries who thronged to the palaces of St. Petersburg. This was a role for which she was profoundly unsuited, prone to headaches and fatigue that made the demands of social life almost unbearable. She did her duty, attending the functions that were required of her, but she did so without the warmth and graciousness that might have won over her critics. Instead, her reserve was interpreted as coldness, her shyness as arrogance, her discomfort as contempt. The nobles who might have become her allies instead became her enemies. Offended by what they perceived as her disdain for Russian society, in Russian ways, she took refuge in her family, in the domestic sphere that was the only place she truly felt at home. Children came in rapid succession, 4 daughters in the first several years of the marriage, each one adored by her parents, but each one also a source of growing anxiety. The empire needed a male heir, a son to inherit the throne and continue the Romanov line. Without a son, the succession would pass to the emperor's brother or nephew, creating the possibility of a disputed succession, of instability, of the kind of dynastic crisis that had toppled thrones before. The pressure to produce a son was immense, felt not only by the empress herself, but by the entire court, the entire government, the entire nation. With each daughter that was born, the whispers grew louder, the criticism more pointed, the empress's position more precarious. She was failing in the most fundamental duty of a royal wife, the duty to produce an heir. No amount of private happiness could compensate for this public failure. The son she so desperately wanted finally arrived in the summer of 1904. A boy who was named Alexei after one of the early Romanov Tsars and greeted with celebrations across the empire. Church bells rang, cannons fired salutes, and the Russian people rejoiced that their dynasty was secured for another generation. The empress, exhausted from the birth, but delirious with joy, held her son in her arms and wept with relief. After 10 years of marriage, after 4 daughters, after all the whispers and the criticism and the pressure, she had finally done what was expected of her. She had given Russia an heir. But the joy of the birth was quickly overshadowed by a terrible discovery. A discovery that would shape the rest of the empress's life and contribute, in ways both direct and indirect, to the fall of the empire itself. The child was sick. Within weeks of his birth, it became apparent that something was seriously wrong. When the baby bumped against the side of his crib, bruises appeared that took weeks to heal. When he was circumcised according to Jewish custom, as was traditional for Romanov heirs, the bleeding would not stop. The doctors were summoned, examined the child, and delivered a diagnosis that fell upon the empress like a death sentence. The boy had hemophilia, a disease of the blood that prevented it from clotting normally. Every cut, every bruise, every minor injury that would be trivial for a healthy child became a life-threatening emergency for the heir to the Russian throne. Internal bleeding could occur spontaneously, causing excruciating pain and potentially fatal complications. There was no cure, no effective treatment, nothing that medical science could offer except the hope that with careful management, the child might survive to adulthood. The empress understood immediately what this meant, for she knew more about hemophilia than most people of her era. The disease ran in her family, passed down through the female line from her grandmother, Queen Victoria. Victoria herself had been a carrier, and she had transmitted the defective gene to several of her daughters, who had in turn transmitted it to their sons. The empress's own brother had died of hemophilia, bleeding to death after a minor accident, and she had watched helplessly as the disease had claimed other relatives as well. She knew that she herself was a carrier, that she had passed the curse to her son, that she was responsible, however innocently, for the suffering that awaited him. The guilt she felt was overwhelming, a burden that she would carry for the rest of her life. And the fear, the constant gnawing fear that her son might die at any moment, that a fall from a horse or a bump against a table might trigger the bleeding that would end his life. This fear consumed her, drove her to the edge of madness, and made her willing to do things that she would never have considered otherwise. The empress guarded the secret of her son's illness with ferocious intensity. Only a handful of people knew the truth: the emperor, a few trusted doctors, the most intimate members of the household. The Russian people were not told, the government was not told, even most of the extended family was kept in the dark. Empress feared, with some justification, that if the Russian people learned that their future czar was chronically ill, possibly fatally ill, their confidence in the dynasty would be shaken. A sick heir was a weak heir, and weakness invited challenges, invited pretenders, invited the kind of instability that could bring down a throne, so the secret was kept year after year. Even as the child's episodes of bleeding became more frequent, more severe, more difficult to conceal, the empress spent her days in an agony of anxiety, watching her son's every movement, terrified that the next fall, the next bump, the next innocent childhood accident might be the one that killed him. It was in this state of maternal desperation that she first encountered the man who would become the most infamous figure in the story of the Russian Empire's fall. He was a wandering peasant from Siberia, a man of wild appearance and strange manners, with long, unkempt hair and a beard that reached to his chest. His eyes were said to be hypnotic, capable of holding the gaze of anyone who looked into them, and his manner combined an unsettling familiarity with moments of apparent spiritual insight. He claimed to possess healing powers granted by God, the ability to cure diseases that baffled doctors, to bring relief where medicine had failed. His name was Grigory Yefimovich Rasputin, though history would remember him simply as Rasputin, a name that would become synonymous with corruption, manipulation, and the decay of empires. When this man was brought before the Empress and asked to pray for her son, something remarkable seemed to happen. The boy's bleeding stopped. His condition improved. The crisis that had seemed about to claim his life receded, and he began to recover. Whether this was due to divine intervention, as the Empress believed, or to coincidence, as skeptics insisted, or to some psychological mechanism by which the calming presence of the healer reduced the anxiety of the mother and thus of the child, no one could say for certain. Medical historians have speculated that Rasputin's ability to help the boy might have had a rational explanation. Perhaps his insistence that the doctors stop administering aspirin, which was then commonly used as a pain reliever, but which also thins the blood and makes bleeding worse. But the Empress did not care about rational explanations. She believed, with the fierce and unshakable faith that characterized everything she did, that this man had been sent by God to save her son, and from that moment on, she would not hear a word against him. Rasputin's influence at court grew steadily over the years that followed, became a fixture in the imperial household. Welcomed by the Empress, even as the rest of the Russian elite looked on with horror and disgust, his behavior was scandalous by any standard. His origins were low. His claims to holiness were doubted by everyone except the Empress herself. Drank to excess, he caroused with women of questionable reputation. He boasted of his influence over the imperial family in ways that were both indiscreet and alarming. The nobles of St. Petersburg whispered about him in their salons. The newspapers hinted at his misdeeds in carefully worded articles, and the enemies of the dynasty seized upon his presence as evidence that the Romanovs had lost their way. But the Empress defended him against all critics, insisting that his powers were real, that his presence was necessary for her son's survival, that attacks on him were attacks on her family. And the Emperor, who loved his wife and shared her desperation about their son, allowed her to have her way. The court was scandalized. The aristocracy was outraged. And whispers began to spread throughout the empire that the Empress, that German woman, was under the influence of a mad monk who was using her to control the government. These whispers were exaggerated, but they were not entirely without foundation. Rasputin did have access to the imperial family that was denied to far more qualified advisors. He did offer his opinions on matters of state, and the Empress did listen to him. Sometimes more than she listened to the trained ministers and officials who were supposed to be guiding the empire. His advice was often foolish, based on nothing, more than peasant superstition and personal whim. But it carried weight because the Empress believed that a man who could heal her son must also possess wisdom in other matters. This was a logical fallacy, of course, but logic had little purchase in a household dominated by fear and desperation, and an almost mystical faith in divine providence. The damage that Rasputin did to the reputation of the dynasty was immense, far greater than any actual influence he had over policy. The Russian people saw a government that seemed to be enthralled to a debauched peasant, an empress who trusted a charlatan over her own ministers, an emperor who was too weak to control his wife. The image of the autocracy, that carefully cultivated picture of strength and wisdom and divine right, was being destroyed by gossip and scandal. And the Empress, who might have saved the situation by simply dismissing Rasputin, refused to do so. She could not dismiss him because she believed that her son's life depended on him. Every time the boy fell ill, every time the bleeding began, Rasputin was summoned, and every time, or so it seemed, the boy recovered. The Empress saw the hand of God in these recoveries, and she would not turn away from what she believed to be divine assistance, no matter how much it cost her in public esteem. Meanwhile, the world outside the palace was changing in ways that the imperial family seemed unable to comprehend. The early 20th century was an era of revolution and upheaval, of new ideas and new movements that challenged the old order. In 1905, a peaceful march of workers to the Winter Palace had been met with gunfire from the imperial guards. Hundreds of unarmed protesters were killed or wounded, and the massacre, which became known as Bloody Sunday, sparked a wave of strikes and uprisings that nearly toppled the dynasty. For months, the empire tottered on the brink of collapse. As workers went on strike, peasants burned manor houses, and soldiers and sailors mutinied against their officers. The emperor was forced to make concessions he had never imagined making, granting a constitution, allowing the formation of a parliament called the Duma, promising reforms that would transform Russia from an absolute autocracy into something approaching a constitutional monarchy. These concessions saved the throne, at least for the moment, but they were grudging and incomplete, and the underlying tensions that had caused the uprising remained unresolved. The peasants were still poor, still bound to the land, still living in conditions that had changed little since medieval times. The workers were still exploited, laboring long hours in dangerous factories for wages that barely kept them alive. The intellectuals were still dreaming of more radical transformations, of socialism and revolution, of a world turned upside down. And the autocracy, despite its concessions, still clung to as much of its power as it could, still resisted genuine reform, still believed that it could maintain the old order through a combination of repression and limited accommodation. The constitution that had been granted could be suspended at will. The Duma that had been allowed could be dissolved when it became troublesome. The promises that had been made could be broken when they became inconvenient. The revolution of 1905 had been defeated, but it had not been forgotten. And those who had made it waited for the moment when they would try again. The war that began in 1914 would provide that moment, stripping away the facade of stability that had kept the empire intact and revealing the rot that had been growing at its core for decades. The war itself began in the Balkans, that volatile region where the interests of the great powers collided and where nationalist passions burned with a fierce intensity. The heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated in the Bosnian city of Sarajevo by a young Serbian nationalist who dreamed of freeing his people from Habsburg rule. The assassination set off a chain reaction of ultimatums and mobilizations that drew all of Europe into the conflict. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia and issued demands that were designed to be unacceptable. Russia mobilized to support its Slavic brethren in Serbia, as the Tsar had promised to do. Germany mobilized to support its ally Austria-Hungary, and then, following long-prepared war plans, attacked France through neutral Belgium. France mobilized because it was bound by treaty to Russia. Britain, reluctantly but inevitably, was drawn in as well. Outraged by the violation of Belgian neutrality and determined to prevent any single power from dominating the continent. Within weeks, the entire continent was at war. A war that would prove to be unlike any that had come before. The armies were vast, larger than any that had ever been assembled in human history. Millions of men mobilized and sent to the front lines. The weapons were devastating, products of the industrial age that could kill on a scale that previous generations could not have imagined. Machine guns mowed down attacking infantry by the thousands. Artillery shells churned the landscape into a moonscape of craters and trenches. Poison gas choked and blinded those who breathed it. And the casualties were beyond anything that anyone had anticipated. Hundreds of thousands dead in single battles. Millions dead by the end of the first year, and still the war ground on, consuming the wealth and youth of nations, leaving behind a landscape of destruction that seemed to stretch to the horizon. For the German-born Empress of Russia, the war was a particular agony. Her adopted country was at war with the land of her birth. She found herself trapped between two identities that could not be reconciled. Her brother was fighting in the German army, commanding troops against the Russian soldiers whom she now considered her own people. Her cousins were scattered across both sides of the conflict, killing each other in battles whose names would become synonymous with slaughter. She threw herself into the war effort with desperate energy, working as a nurse in military hospitals, tending to wounded soldiers with her own hands, organizing relief efforts and charities and all the activities that were expected of an empress in wartime. She wanted to prove her loyalty to Russia, to demonstrate that she was Russian now. Heart and soul, that her German birth was an accident of fate that had no bearing on her devotion to her. adopted homeland. But her efforts were not enough to silence the whispers. Too many Russians, she remained a German, an enemy alien sitting at the heart of power. A potential traitor who might at any moment betray the country she claimed to serve. Rumors spread that she was a spy. She was passing military secrets to her German relatives, that she was sabotaging the Russian war effort from within. These rumors were entirely false, the product of suspicion and prejudice, rather than any evidence of actual wrongdoing. But in wartime, truth is often the first casualty. And the rumors took on a life of their own, repeated and embellished, until they became accepted fact in the minds of many. The empress, who had never felt fully accepted in Russia, now found herself actively hated, blamed for defeats that had nothing to do with her, suspected of treachery that she had never contemplated. Her isolation deepened, her trust in anyone outside her immediate family evaporated, and she retreated further into the private world of her husband and children and the peasant healer, who alone seemed able to help her suffering son. The strain of the warriors took its toll on the entire imperial family, but especially on the emperor and empress. Nicholas spent most of his time at military headquarters, far from the capital, having taken personal command of the Russian armies in a gesture that was meant to inspire confidence, but that instead made him personally responsible for every defeat. The empress was left to manage affairs at home, to oversee the government in her husband's absence, a role she was ill-suited for, in which her critics were quick to condemn. She relied more than ever on Rasputin, whose influence now extended far beyond the sick room of the heir. He recommended ministers for appointment and dismissal, offered advice on matters of war and peace, meddled in affairs of state with a brazenness that appalled everyone who learned of it. The ministers who served the emperor despaired at the chaos this caused, but they were powerless to intervene. The empress trusted the healer absolutely, and the emperor trusted his empress. Rasputin was finally killed in December of 1916, murdered by a group of nobles who believed that removing him would save the dynasty. The conspirators lured him to a palace with the promise of meeting a beautiful woman, fed him poisoned cakes and wine that seemed to have no effect, shot him multiple times, beat him, and finally threw him into the frozen Neva River, where he drowned. The murder was brutal, almost comically so, and it made Rasputin into a martyr in the eyes of the empress. She had lost her healer, her advisor, the man she believed had kept her son alive, and she blamed the Russian aristocracy for taking him from her, but the murder came too late to save the dynasty. The damage had been done. The reputation of the imperial family had been destroyed. The forces of revolution were already gathering strength. Within 3 months of Rasputin's death, the Romanov dynasty would cease to exist. The end, when it came, was swift and unexpected. In February of 1917, food shortages in the capital reached a critical point. Bread lines stretched for blocks, and women who had waited for hours in the freezing cold went home empty-handed. Workers went on strike, first in one factory, then another, then across the entire city. Soldiers were ordered to fire on the protesters, but this time, unlike in 1905, they refused. The troops who had been brought in to maintain order instead joined the revolution, turning their weapons against their officers, opening the prisons, and marching alongside the workers and the women who had started the uprising. Within days, the 300-year-old Romanov dynasty had collapsed. The emperor, isolated at military headquarters, was unable to reach the capital. His generals told him that the situation was hopeless, that the army would no longer obey him, that his only choice was to abdicate. On March 15, 1917, Nicholas II signed the document that ended his reign and the reign of his dynasty. He hoped that by abdicating in favor of his brother, he might save the throne for his family. But his brother refused the crown, knowing that it was already worthless. And Russia became a republic. The imperial family was placed under arrest, their palaces confiscated, their servants dismissed, their freedom increasingly restricted. They were moved from place to place as the new government tried to decide what to do with them. First to the Alexander Palace, outside the capital. Then to a governor's mansion in Siberia, and finally to a merchant's house in the remote city of Yekaterinburg. The Empress, who had never fully understood the forces that had been arrayed against her, could not comprehend why her people had turned against her. She had loved Russia, she insisted, had given everything for Russia, had devoted her life to, serving the country that had become her home. But her love had not been enough, and her service had not been recognized. Now she was a prisoner, awaiting a fate that grew darker with each passing month. The peasant healer who might have comforted her was dead, murdered by the nobles she had always distrusted. Her husband, who had been her rock and her refuge, was broken by the weight of his failure. And her children, the 4 daughters and the precious son for whom she had sacrificed so much, were trapped with her in an increasingly precarious situation. The First Empire had fallen. The vast Russian realm that had stretched from Poland to the Pacific, that had commanded the largest army in Europe, that had been ruled by the Romanov dynasty for 3 centuries, was gone. In its place, a provisional government struggled to maintain order while continuing the war against Germany, a war that the Russian people had grown to hate. Revolutionary parties competed for power, promising peace and land and bread to a population that was exhausted and desperate. And in the chaos, a small but disciplined group of radicals called the Bolsheviks, led by a man named Vladimir Lenin, prepared to seize their moment. In October of 1917, they struck, overthrowing the provisional government and establishing a new regime that would reshape the world in ways even more profound than the dynasty it had replaced. The Russian Empire was dead. The Soviet Union was being born, while Russia convulsed in revolution. The German Empire was also beginning to crack under the strain of war. The British naval blockade had cut off imports of food and raw materials, causing widespread hunger and hardship. The winter of 1916 to 1917, known as the Turnip Winter, was especially brutal. With the German civilian population reduced to eating animal fodder and whatever else could be scraped together. Children went hungry, the elderly died of malnutrition, and even the middle classes, who had begun the war with patriotic enthusiasm, began to wonder whether the sacrifices being demanded of them were worth it. The army, which had seemed invincible at the war's beginning, was exhausted by years of fighting on multiple fronts. Its best soldiers dead, its reserves depleted, its morale beginning to crack. The spring offensive of 1918, a last desperate gamble to win the war before American troops could arrive in force, came tantalizingly close to success, but ultimately failed, leaving the German military with nothing left to give. News from the Eastern Front had initially seemed promising. Collapse meant that Germany no longer had to fight a 2-front war, and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed with the new Bolshevik government, gave Germany vast territories in Eastern Europe. But these gains came too late and cost too much. The troops that had been stationed in the east were transferred to the west, but they brought with them the revolutionary ideas they had encountered in Russia, ideas about peace and socialism and the rights of workers that spread through the German army like a contagion. Meanwhile, the Allied powers, reinforced by fresh American troops and supplied by American industry, launched a series of offensives that pushed the German lines back, further and further. By autumn, it was clear to the German military command that the war could not be won. The only question was how it would end, and what would become of the empire that had staked everything on victory. Revolution broke out in Germany in the autumn of 1918, spreading from the port cities of the north to the industrial centers of the interior. Sailors in Kiel mutinied, refusing to put to sea for a final suicidal battle against the British fleet. Workers in Berlin and Munich and other cities took to the streets, demanding an end to the war and the abdication of the Kaiser. Soldiers and workers' councils, modeled on the Soviets that had sprung up in Russia, began to form across the country, challenging the authority of the traditional government. The Kaiser Wilhelm II, who had ruled with such confidence and bluster, who had rattled his saber and proclaimed Germany's destiny to dominate Europe, found himself abandoned by his generals and his people. On November 9th, 1918, he fled into exile in the Netherlands, never to return. The German Empire, That proud and powerful realm that had seemed destined to lead Europe into a new age of Teutonic greatness, was no more. In its place, a fragile republic struggled to be born, burdened from its first moments by the legacy of defeat and the resentments that defeat would breed. The armistice that ended the fighting came 2 days later, on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. The guns fell silent along the Western Front, and millions of soldiers who had spent years in the trenches emerged into a world transformed beyond recognition. The war had killed somewhere between 15 and 20 million people, soldiers and civilians alike, and it had wounded millions more, leaving a generation scarred in body and mind. The empires that had gone to war in 1914 with such confidence and such enthusiasm had been shattered. Their ruling dynasties swept away, their territories divided and redistributed by the victorious powers. The old order was gone, and nothing that would replace it could restore what had been lost. The German Empire, which had existed for less than 50 years, had burned brightly and then burned out, consumed by the fires of a war it had helped to start but could not finish. The Austro-Hungarian Empire fell even faster than its German ally, disintegrating not through revolution alone, but through the centrifugal forces that had been building within it for generations. The empire had entered the war in a position of fundamental weakness, held together only by the aging Emperor Franz Joseph, who had sat upon the Habsburg throne since 1848, and who embodied in his very person the unity of the realm. When Franz Joseph died in November of 1916, after nearly 68 years on the throne, his successor inherited a realm that was already falling apart. The new Emperor Karl was young and well-meaning, but he lacked the authority and the experience to hold together what his great-uncle had spent a lifetime building. The various nationalities within the empire, who had suppressed their aspirations during Franz Joseph's reign out of loyalty to the old emperor, now saw no reason to continue their sacrifice for a dynasty that seemed doomed. The Czechs and Slovaks began to organize for independence, forming a provisional government in exile and lobbying the Allied powers for recognition. The Poles looked to reconstitute their ancient nation, partitioned for over a century between Austria, Germany, and Russia, from the ruins of all three empires. The South Slavs, the Croats, and Slovenes and Serbs, who had lived under Habsburg rule, dreamed of uniting with the independent Kingdom of Serbia to form a new nation of the South Slavic peoples. The Romanians prepared to claim Transylvania, where millions of their fellow nationals lived under Hungarian rule, and even the Hungarians, who had been partners with the Austrians in the dual monarchy, began to calculate whether their interests might be better served by independence than by continued association with a sinking ship. By the autumn of 1918, the empire had simply ceased to exist. It did not fall in a dramatic collapse, did not go down fighting in a final blaze of glory. It dissolved like sugar in water, fragmenting into a dozen successor states that would redraw the map of Central Europe. The Habsburg dynasty, which had ruled in one form or another for more than 6 centuries, was swept away, its members scattered into exile, its territories divided among nations that had not existed a few years before. The new states that emerged from the wreckage, Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, and an enlarged Romania and a reconstituted Poland, were themselves unstable, containing within their borders the same ethnic tensions that had plagued the empire they replaced. The peace settlement that followed the war, dictated by the victorious allies at Versailles and other venues, redrew the map of Europe according to principles of national self-determination that could not be consistently applied. Millions of people found themselves minorities in countries they had not chosen. Germans in Czechoslovakia and Hungary and Romania and Ukrainians in Poland. Seeds of future conflicts that would bear bitter fruit in the decades to come. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was gone, but the problems it had tried and failed to solve would continue to haunt Europe for generations, while the German and Austro-Hungarian empires were collapsing in the autumn of 1918. The former Russian imperial family met their end in a basement in Yekaterinburg. The Bolsheviks, who now controlled Russia, had kept the Romanovs imprisoned for over a year. Uncertain what to do with them, debating whether to put the former Tsar on trial or or simply to hold him indefinitely. But as the summer of 1918 brought civil war to Russia as anti-Bolshevik forces advanced toward Yekaterinburg, the decision was made to eliminate the family rather than allow them to be rescued and used as a rallying point for the counter-revolution. In the early hours of July 17th, the family was awakened by their guards and told to gather in the basement of the house where they had been held. They were told that they were being moved for their own safety, that the White armies were approaching, and that the house was no longer secure. The former Tsar carried his ailing son in his arms, for the boy was too weak to walk, his hemophilia having caused yet another episode of internal bleeding. When the family was assembled in the basement, along with the few servants who had remained loyal to them, a group of armed men entered the room. Their leader read out a brief statement announcing that the Ural Soviet had decided to execute their former Tsar. Nicholas barely had time to respond, to ask what this meant, before the shooting began. The execution was chaotic and brutal, the small room filling with smoke and screams, bullets ricocheting off the walls and the jewels that the Grand Duchesses had sewn into their corsets for safekeeping. When the shooting stopped, some of the victims were still alive, and the executioners finished them off with bayonets and pistols. The former Tsar died quickly, shot through the head. The Empress, who had crossed herself and begun to pray as the executioners raised their weapons, died moments later. Their 4 daughters, young women who had done nothing wrong except to be born into the wrong family at the wrong time, died in terror and confusion. And the boy, the hemophiliac heir, for whom so much had been sacrificed, whose illness had brought Rasputin into the family's circle and contributed so much to their downfall, was killed as well, shot and bayoneted until there was no life left in him. The bodies were taken away and disposed of in secret, burned with acid and gasoline, buried in shallow graves in the forests outside the city. For decades, the fate of the Romanovs remained officially unknown, the subject of rumors and speculation and occasional claims by pretenders who insisted they had somehow survived the massacre. It was not until the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, that the remains were discovered and identified through DNA analysis. The family was finally given a proper burial in 1998, laid to rest in the Cathedral of Saints Peter and Paul in St. Petersburg, where generations of Romanovs had been interred before them. The Russian Orthodox Church canonized them as passion bearers, martyrs who had accepted their deaths with Christian humility, and they became the objects of veneration for millions of believers. The Empress, who had been blamed for so much, who had been called a German spy and a destroyer of Russia, was now a saint, her sufferings redeemed in the eyes of her church, if not in the judgment of history. The 3 empires that fell in the years between 1917 and 1918 had dominated European politics for generations. Their collapse reshaped the world in ways that we are still living with today. The Russian Revolution gave birth to the Soviet Union, a power that would challenge the West for most of the 20th century, that would inspire revolutionary movements across the globe, and whose legacy continues to shape international relations even now, decades after its own collapse. The German defeat in the First World War led directly to the rise of National Socialism and the Second World War, the deadliest conflict in human history, a war that killed tens of millions and culminated in the horror of the Holocaust. The dissolution of Austria-Hungary created a patchwork of successor states in Central Europe that would be the site of ethnic conflicts and political instability for decades. Conflicts that erupted again in the 1990s with the violent breakup of Yugoslavia. All of this can be traced back, if one follows the threads far enough, to the decisions made about a young princess in the late 19th century, to the marriage that connected 3 doomed dynasties, to the choices made and the mistakes committed by people who could not have known where their actions would lead. The Empress, who was blamed for so much, is remembered today, and she is remembered at all as a tragic figure, a woman who meant well, but who was in over her head. The romantic story of her courtship with the young emperor has been retold many times, often sympathetically, as a tale of true love in an age of arranged marriages. Her devotion to her sick son has been portrayed as the love of a mother willing to do anything to save her child, not the obsession of a fanatic who sacrificed the welfare of an empire for the sake of one boy. Her reliance on Rasputin has been explained, even excused, as the desperation of a parent grasping at any hope. However irrational, when conventional medicine offered none, and there is truth in all of this. She was not a monster. She was not a villain. She was a human being with all the flaws and limitations that implies. Thrust into a position of power for which she was not prepared, and which she did not know how to handle. But she was also a human being in a position of enormous responsibility, a position where her personal failings had consequences far beyond her own life. The mismatch between her abilities and her role contributed to the destabilization of an already unstable regime. Her inability to win the trust of the Russian aristocracy, her reliance on an advisor who was widely despised, her interference in matters of government that she did not understand, all of these weakened the dynasty at the moment when it most needed strength. She did not cause the Russian Revolution by herself. No single individual could have done that, but she was a factor. One thread in the tapestry of causation that led to the fall of the Romanovs. And through the connections between the royal houses of Europe, through the alliances that had been forged through marriage and blood, her story became entangled with the stories of the other empires as well. The war that destroyed Russia also destroyed Germany and Austro-Hungary, and the war itself was made possible by a system of alliances and rivalries that had been built, in part, on the marriages of princesses just like her. The story of the teenage girl who destroyed 3 empires is not really about blame. It is about the fragility of power and the unpredictability of history. The empires that fell in the early 20th century had stood for generations, for centuries. In some cases, they seemed permanent, invincible, destined to endure forever. Their armies were vast, their bureaucracies were elaborate. Their rulers sat upon thrones that had been occupied by their ancestors for as long as anyone could remember. And yet they fell, all 3 of them, in the span of just a few years, swept away by forces that their rulers could not control and, in many cases, could not even understand. The young princess who became empress was part of the system that fell. Her marriage was one strand in the web of alliances that held the old order together. When that strand weakened, when she proved unable to fulfill the role that had been assigned to her, the entire web became less stable. She did not destroy the empires on her own. No single individual could have done that. But she was there, at the crucial moment, in the crucial place, making the crucial mistakes that helped to bring down a world, today. The empires she helped to destroy are distant memories, studied in history books but no longer living realities. The palaces where she walked are now museums, visited by tourists who marvel at the gilded splendor of a vanished age. The thrones where her husband and his fellow monarchs sat are empty. Their last occupants long dead, their descendants living as private citizens in a world that has no place for them. The world she knew has vanished so completely that it can be difficult to imagine it ever existed, that world of emperors and empresses, of royal courts and dynastic marriages, of power wielded by the few over the many without apology or explanation. And yet, the echoes of that vanished world continue to shape our own. The borders drawn after the First World War still define nations today. The ideologies born in the revolutions of that era, communism and fascism, and the various reactions against them, still compete for adherence. The questions about power and legitimacy that the fall of the empires raised have never been fully answered. History does not end, continues, carrying the past into the future, connecting us to people and events we have never known but whose influence we cannot escape. The teenage girl who destroyed 3 empires has been dead for over a century now. Her bones, discovered decades after her death in a forest outside Yekaterinburg, have been laid to rest with those of her husband and children in the cathedral where Romanovs had been buried for generations. The Orthodox Church that she embraced with such fervor has canonized her as a saint, recognizing her as a martyr who died for her faith and accepting her into the company of the holy. To some, she remains a villain. The German woman who brought down Holy Russia through her foolishness and her stubbornness and her misplaced trust in a peasant charlatan. To others, she is a victim, a woman crushed by forces she could not control, punished for sins that were not hers alone. And to still others, she is simply a puzzle, a reminder that history is never as simple as it seems, that causes and effects are tangled together in ways that can take generations to understand. Perhaps all of these perspectives contain some truth. Perhaps the full truth is beyond our ability to grasp. What is certain is that her life mattered. The choices made about her and by her had consequences that extended far beyond her own existence. She was a teenage girl, born into a world she did not choose, raised to fulfill a role she did not select, married off to serve interests she did not control. And she became, through no will of her own, one of the most consequential figures in history. The empires fell, the old world ended, and a new world was born from the ashes. She was there at the center of it all, a witness and a participant, and, in some measure, a cause. And now, across the distance of centuries, we can only wonder what she thought, what she felt, and whether she ever understood the weight of the role that fate had assigned her. The world turns, and history continues. The empires are gone, but new powers have risen to take their place. The dynasties have fallen, but new forms of government have emerged. The old certainties have crumbled, but new questions have taken their place. And through it all, the story of the past remains with us, a reminder of what has been, and a warning of what might yet be. The teenage girl who destroyed 3 empires is part of that story now, her life woven into the larger tapestry of human events. She was not the sole cause of all that followed, but she was part of the cause. She was not the answer to the questions history poses, but she is part of the answer. And as long as we continue to study the past, to search for understanding in the chaos of events, her story will continue to be told, her life will continue to matter, her influence will continue to be felt. She was a girl, and she became an empress, and empires fell. That is her legacy. That is what remains. And in the quiet of the night, as the centuries stretch out behind us and before us, her story reminds us that history is made not only by the powerful, but also by those who never sought power at all, and that the consequences of a single life can echo through time in ways that no one could have predicted.